So right now, I get the opportunity to put you to sleep and to bore you today. You guys hear from me on a fairly frequent basis. So, but actually, the part of what I'm going to talk about is really the value of telling a story. This is a thing I could basically go on and on and on about because it is something that really means a lot to me. And as a property rights person, as property rights people, I think it's a skill that in order for us to win, we must master this skill, because the vast majority of people in this room think about things in terms of, just because I'm looking across the room, I know many of you have a science or engineering background. You think of facts, you think of the history, the detailed history. I mean, Elaine was just talking about all the detailed history and the laws that go into creating tribal government in the way that we've looked at it today, the evolution of the Growth Management Act, the 754 pages in your Shoreline Hearings Report, and the 3,000 pages that you submitted to get standing on that potential litigation on GMA hearing, and all of these other issues that we go through. The way we tend to talk about that amongst ourselves or with somebody else who would be considered an insider is an ineffective way of winning people over to our side, or convincing them that there's a problem that you have to join with us, that the fight against our property rights, the fight that we're experiencing personally, that those of us who are willing to take Saturday to come here, that means so much to us, that isn't going to be what inspires those other people to come and help us. It isn't going to be what inspires them to jump in and join with us. Now, some of them will. They'll jump in when they realize that they can't build a house on their property that they bought 15 years ago and saved their whole life to. That suddenly they become motivated because it becomes personal. But what we have to do is we have to have the ability to tell stories about what's actually happening to other people. And the ability to tell a story about in your own life is actually a really hard one. And I'm going to give one short example, I think, here, and you can critique it. But the most important thing is for us to learn how to tell a story about somebody else. What's happening to somebody else? Yesterday, before I drove over here, I have my own blog site as well. And before I left, I had a story that was going on in Thurston County. I like to write about stories in my community. This is an incredible skill that people, and I'm not a great writer, but it is one that we need to cultivate amongst ourselves. We need to have the ability to report on what's going on in our communities. There is no longer media the way that we used to. Many of us, even still in this room, still think that there's a media out there. The collapse of traditional journalism, and I mean the cataclysmic total collapse of journalism, the way that we've always imagined it, means that there is nobody to report on local stories unless we do it ourselves, for the most part. I don't know how media is going to transition. There's lots of people smarter than I am looking at that. But the fact is, we have to have that ability to tell stories about what's going on in our community, report on it, opinionate on it, write about it, but at least talk about it. Stories that otherwise would get no coverage, never be spoken about. And because what media there is that's left tends to be quite biased, at least against the viewpoints that many of us would have in this room, the way they report on those stories, if they do, will not be the same way that you and I would want to report on it, or that we think it should be reported in our community. I wrote an article yesterday just before I left to drive over here. In fact, it made me a little bit late, just getting it finished and putting it up. And I wrote a story about and the reason why I'm looking at my phone is I want to see this information. But I wrote a story about Latin Cider Mill Farms, which is in Thurston County. I've known the Latins family now for 8 years. They have a little agritourism sort of business there. They've had it for decades, and they let people on their farm, and they get a pet goats, and they make their own apple cider. It's been an agritourism, which is a new word coined, but it's an agritourism business. It's the most popular and well-known farm in Thurston County, visited by tens of thousands of people a year. And they've had goats there for forever, and somebody filed animal cruelty charges against them, which is fine. A lot of ignorant people, people from the city, right, who aren't necessarily going to be familiar with what animal husbandry is or what it looks like, come out there, and so they don't know what they're looking at, or they see a problem, or a goat might just have hurt itself, and they're going to say there's limpy goats, whatever. So they're going to get complaints. It happens all the time. You open your place up to the public, that's what's going to happen. We have a sheriff's office and a prosecutor's department that we expect to be able to be moderating on disputes or complaints or frivolous things that happen. And unfortunately in Thurston County, we seem to have lost that check and balance. And so instead of dealing with a complaint that would be probably fairly common that people will file against anybody that has animals in the county, they decided to go all SWAT and bring in the emergency search order and the big trailers, and they seized, well, they didn't know how many goats they seized because they miscounted them. But eventually they figured out that they had taken 18 goats from the Latin Cider Mill Farms and charged them with animal cruelty. And it turns out that it looks like it's just going to be an argument between vets. Then now the county never got a vet report about it. Anyway, I wrote this story because I've been pretty upset about it. I wrote a story when they first did the SWAT team raid and seized the animals and took them to a secret black site in Thurston County where nobody could find them. And, rendition is like taking a terrorist out somewhere, right? So they hide them in a secret black site somewhere. And then, they were trying to get their goats back, and it turns out they finally had a neutral location where they could bring the goats, and they had the vet come out and look at it. It turns out the goats are actually now in worse shape than they ever were before because they've been abused in whatever location they've been put in, and so it just turned into a terrible circus. And it isn't about the disputes between the people. It's about how we want our neighbors to be treated, right? If they're going to treat these people this way, how could they treat us? So of course, instead of being reasonable, the prosecutor, recognizing when you've made a mistake, what does a bureaucracy do when it's been proven to be made a mistake? They double down on dumb, and they decide to go even farther down the road. So instead of just trying to charge, when they realized they were going to be facing a jury trial in a county in which almost every kid there has been to this farm, and had photos taken with the goats. In fact, the farm right in the middle of the animal cruelty charge, it just got a King 5 news recognition. It's one of the top 5 farms in Washington State. And the video they used were the goats running around, but it's animal cruelty somehow. And so the prosecutors realizing that they're going to lose this case. And so what do? They try to go scorched earth on the animal, on the farm, attack them, try to get them to lose their customers, try to get people to boycott them, whisper campaigns, right? Because they had just this animal rights extremist running in the sheriff's office, taking a job that probably nobody really wanted. It's got to be a miserable job going out and getting animal cruelty charges. You'd be the police officer. I wrote the article yesterday just about what was going on. And since it's been almost 24 hours since I published it, 30,000 people have read that article, and it's been liked 2,100 times on Facebook. There's power in telling stories, right? Now, it doesn't, not every article, I wish I could say every article I wrote got that kind of traffic, but it's not how it works. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But our ability as an organization to identify injustices or problems is going to be greatly enhanced. Our ability to grow our membership, to find allies, to make a difference, to have an impact on elected officials, to change the law, to do whatever it is to achieve the goals that we have, is going to be greatly enhanced by our ability to tell stories, to influence our neighbors and our strangers, people even that we disagree with, to influence them, and to be able to tell a story like that so that people realize something's wrong. They may not agree with how I told that story, but something's wrong. This isn't right. Is this how you want to be treated? When I really got involved in activism again in Thurston County, it was about the pocket gopher that was being listed as endangered species. And this pocket gopher thrived in the middle of the artillery impact zone in Fort Lewis. Right? It was the most destroyed piece of ground in Washington State. Since 1911, that piece of ground has been churned by every munition that mankind has ever created short of a nuclear weapon. And I don't believe they ever dropped a Mo out there, but that ground has been turned over. And turned out it has the highest concentration of Mazama pocket gophers in the world, but they're endangered somehow. And they suddenly discovered this, and so we had this Endangered Species Act fight. Now, anybody that knows anything about that federal law knows how difficult those types of fights are in the community, because rational thought and logical thinking and science get thrown out the window right from the beginning, because it's an emotional story, and how dare you evil property owners and farmers and people who live in you are destroying the habitat. Who, my God, can speak for those poor little creatures, except for the geniuses that work in the planning department that just graduated from Evergreen yesterday and know everything. And so that is how the fight happens, right? And that's what we end up dealing with. And so one of the first stories I remember that I told about this to just influence the community so they were aware of what's happening, and you're right next to you, was we told a story about a disabled, Donna Baker, a disabled state worker in a wheelchair who was not allowed to sell part of her property to pay for medical bills because the pocket gopher was found on her property. And it was horrible. It was a terrible, ridiculous, insane story that no modern society or normal place should ever see happen. It just defied logic, right? And more important though, logic is violated all the time by government. It's almost the definition of government. It's a contradiction of logic. But the emotional element of that story really had an impact and it resonated. And it allowed us to start talking about a subject in a very different way than it had been spoken about before. And even though that fight is ongoing, but it's ongoing in a very different way now. The entire county commission has changed. In fact, just last week, the planning director got fired, which should generate, that's right, and that should generate applause every time you hear that. And because of that, things have started to change, but it required us to go out and talk about it in a very different way. And it's not just our own story. We have to know how to tell somebody else's story in a way that influences other people. And people are influenced by emotion. They're emotionally impacted. If you don't believe me, you aren't on Facebook. If you don't believe me, you certainly have never watched television. I don't watch TV actually, and every now and then I get stuck in a hotel and I have to, and I watch it. And then I suddenly realize why I don't watch TV. But emotion, they aren't putting emotional stories or human interest stories up on television just because they want to waste your time. They're putting them up because people react, they get involved, they respond, they care about emotional stories. If you run for political office, anybody that's a reasonable consultant that's in politics, and most of the people who call themselves consultants, they aren't that sharp, but if they're at least fairly capable, they'll tell a personal story about yourself, right? Something that allows people to connect with you. And it's not because it's, a wonkish person. I tend to be a wonkish guy, and I want to get into all the minutiae of all these issues in the detail and talk about, if you go to page 121, if you look at that contradicts, and you just lose everybody. Nobody cares, actually. It's going to be lost as accurate and as factual and as true as that might be. It does not matter. You persuade nobody except for somebody else who's equally as wonkish as you. And there's just not going to be that many people out there. You have to find those emotional stories. Representative Taylor talks about getting up in front of people and telling the story on an email that somebody sends him to try to change the way debate is going on the floor of the House of Representatives. And this is it's as old as humanity. If you go back, what were the stories that the Greeks told to launch a war, right? It's the, what causes the entire city-state to fill up the ships and to travel across the ocean and start a war. It's a story about some poor victimized woman that was taken against her will, and now we got to go and fight the war, right? This is just human nature. But we've forgotten this sometimes. In a science-based world, in a facts-based world, in an internet world where we are used to downloading 250-page PDFs and trying to dig through what the latest change of that buffer zone is going to be on the shoreline clearance board, we lose the ability to communicate to other people who sure as heck are not going to spend the time on a Saturday at Central Washington University talking about this kind of stuff. And I think that it's critical that we learn how to do this. Now, one of the things that I get asked, so I'll practice telling you a story right now. You tell me how this changes how you view me. Not in this audience, but I'll tell you a story about my father. Because people oftentimes wonder, Glenn, why are you such a crazy activist out there, right? So where did this come from? You just did develop it by osmosis? Did you go to Columbia University and get infected? What happened? Why were you this way? And I realized, because it wasn't something you don't think about it, but I realized I was actually influenced by my father a lot. And it's just going to be one of those things you get influenced, but what did he do? Well, I grew up in an incredibly eccentric, which surely shouldn't surprise anybody, environment. The last farm in Newcastle. If anybody knows where Newcastle is today, it's certainly not exactly the epicenter of agriculture. But my dad had 20 acres there, and that's where I grew up originally. And my dad was a very eccentric guy. He was an attorney, but not a regular one. He decided that he liked to raise exotic animals. It was one of the things, so we raised antelope and deer and cranes and storks and pheasants and all kinds of exotic animals. In order to do that, you have to have all kinds of pens. In order to do that, you have to have fences. And in the 60s and 70s, people were shooting their animals, and so we had built this. So we were trying to protect them, so we burned the property, and so we had 8-foot chain link fences with a berm and another 8-foot chain link fence on top, so that the animals couldn't get out of our property. It was just, and that people stopped shooting them and throwing garbage over the fence. And all our problems went away. But it looked like a compound, right? You can't get in very well, so you had to have these big gates. And my dad, being the economical guy that he was, decided that he had a client that was one of the largest building demolition companies in King County. And so, in exchange for legal fees, and those guys are always in trouble, he said he just wants first dibs on the buildings. So as a kid, I grew up recycling long before it was ever cool. We would go out to every one of these, not all, but a lot of these demolition sites all over the Puget Sound area, and we would strip out all the I-beams or the sprinkler system so we could make fence posts or whatever it was. And we would load up, Dad of course had a commercial truck driver's license, so we would load up semi-truck semi-truckloads of stuff on the weekends. That's how I spent my weekends oftentimes growing up, salvaging. And so we took all this great, awesome material back to the farm and we built buildings. Well, despite the fact that my dad was a land use attorney and certainly knew better, he really didn't get a permit for anything. And if anybody happens to know, live in King County, there were 8 major structures that we had put up on the property, 8 major ones. I define major as multiple stories, steel, concrete, incredibly overbuilt in every measure of the way. Many of them probably with the ability to qualify as fallout structures just on their own. But obviously King County, and those of you who have lived there and know how wonderful their planning department and their code enforcement agency is, had aerial photographs of this property, right, going back to the 70s, wondering what the heck is going on here? I mean, what's going on? I mean, big buildings going up, and they knew there were no permits being issued, but it was very difficult for them to get in, because how do you get through big rolling gates and high fences, and there's no way to take photos, right, without having an airplane. They didn't have drones back then. But one day, Dad left the gate open. Oh yeah, and they came in. Mr. Morgan, you are the most egregious violator of building codes in the history of King County. Congratulations. There is no one who has ever violated the volume, scope, spectrum, and variety of building codes as you. In fact, we've never even found anybody close. And so I remember so Dad, being the attorney that he was, eccentric as he was, of course, represented himself, which is usually a terrible thing to do, but he loved every minute of it, and tied them up for about a decade. And as I was going away to college, I remember Dad said, you know, Glenn, I think I'm going to eventually lose this case. So I think what we need to do here is we need a new city. That's the ticket. So when I was going away, any of you know the Growth Management Act debate was going on, and King County didn't want any new cities. So Dad, also being an attorney at the time, and that area was in rapid annexation, right? Renton wanted it from one side, Bellevue wanted it from the other. So Dad helped go after King County, force them to allow new cities. He tied up Renton courts so they couldn't annex the area. And he helped delay Bellevue from advancing too much further past Victoria. All in the process of trying to gather signatures to get a new city on the ballot, which he eventually did. It got on the ballot and it passed. That's the city of Newcastle, if you want to know the true story behind it, because our property was right in the center. And by God, he was going to make sure we were in it. And once the Growth Management Act had just passed a couple years before then, the first rule of any new city was to write a comp plan. And Dad, being well known now, after all this stuff was going on, got on the city council of Newcastle. And the first thing, all the consultants were coming in, they wanted $250,000 to write that new comp plan, because this was the bonanza and they were going to make a lot of money. And he said, he stopped that process in his tracks and he said, my God, we're just a new city, let's start on the right foot. There's nothing in the state law that doesn't prevent an elected official from writing a law. I've been practicing this field for 36 years now. So I will write the comp plan for free. No cost to taxpayers at all, and there you go, which immediately generated an incredible amount of enmity with all of these consultants who were hoping for their big payday, but the comp plan got written, and it was passed, and the first law in that book, in the comp plan, was the grandfather clause, all existing structures in the city of Newcastle. Now, I use that story sometimes because they say you cannot fight City Hall. That's not true, you can, but there are more effective ways of winning those battles. So it was one of those things. Now, to make it worse, imagine what Dad was like as a city councilman. Imagine this, okay, this guy, right? And he was truly eccentric. I love him to death, but he was an eccentric guy. He was also very frugal. And they wanted to build a trail in Newcastle. They had a lot of extra railroad right-of-ways, and the community generally wanted to have a trail in the middle of the city. And so, through one of these old railroad right-of-ways, and people had been dumping garbage and abandoning cars in there. It was an ugly mess. And so they went out to get bids, and it turned out it was going to be $250,000. I don't know why that number keeps popping up, but it was $250,000 in 6 months to build a trail. And Dad was so upset. I remember, because I had a little business, and I was running it out of the farm, and Dad came back from the city council meeting, he was just steamed. And he had got up at the city council meeting, and he said, I can do this myself with a bulldozer in a weekend. What are we paying all these guys all this money for this little trail? So when he got home, he said, Glenn, you're helping me load up the bulldozer. And so I went out there, we loaded up the bulldozer. I didn't quite know what he was going to do, and by God, what do you think he did? So he was out there, blew that whole trail out, got his friend that owned a junkyard down to take away all the junk cars for free, and by the time they filed this emergency cease and desist order on him for illegal clearing of public lands on Monday, the trail was built. Right to engineering specs, right? And he said, I have just donated my labor and time, and the city of Newcastle gets to cost nothing. I just saved you 6 months and $250,000, and I built an exact spec, and now the trail's open. So now they're going to go to court.
When is he going to get out of jail?
Well, and so he said this, and so of course he had this court case coming up, and he said, okay, the city has a choice. We can go to court, and this will be a circus. I'll be in the front page of Seattle Times, and I'll be on Como News, I'll be on the radio stations, and you get to explain to the public why you wanted to spend a lot more money to get to the same position. Or you can drop the case. It's your choice and just take the freebie trail. So they didn't believe him, and so the next day, I remember front page of Seattle Times, Dad knows how to ham it up. He was on the bulldozer, had the pictures taken, right? He was on the news, and the next day the court case got dropped. And the citizens of Newcastle were able to save another $250,000 because of an eccentric guy like that on the city council. Now that doesn't exactly engender a lot of appreciation from the bureaucracy. But I learned a lot being around it. Now at the time, what I remember in my 20s, I was thinking, God, why do I just wasn't cared that much about politics, which is funny, but I wasn't. I burned myself out in college working on campaigns. I just wasn't that interested. And a city council just seemed such a small ball to me. But Dad would come back from these city council meetings just telling me all these stories, and they were hilarious. I mean, I was laughing at them. But I'll tell you what, I had no appreciation for them then compared to what I do now. But if you want to know how you grow an activist, you have dads like that. We have to be able to tell stories that influence people. We have to tell stories that paint a picture that make people think about change their mind about something, make them think differently about something. Take a story about an animal cruelty charge that you could turn these people into evil people, or you can tell the truth about what's actually going on in the abuse of government, but in a way that actually exposes what's happening. You can tell a story about the Endangered Species Act in a way that people realize the absurdity of what's happening in the community, rather than the argument about the science. Now, CAPR and I used to do this when I was at the Freedom Foundation too, Tales of Tyranny stories. We've done this with video. Video is a very powerful tool. It's an underutilized tool on our side. CAPR made a series of videos last year. I've actually got a partial one on the Fox family that the Hearst decision came out when I was working on it. It kind of threw off how I was going to finish that one, but I'll finish it and do something else with it. But we have to use the tools that we have. But not everybody's going to have the ability to have a video. Not everybody's going to have the ability to use animation or do whatever. It's a skill it takes a number of people to get involved in doing it. CAPR needs to do more of it. We need to do more of it. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good enough, but find ways of telling these stories and connect with people in your community who are being abused. One of the things that I think happens a lot, and especially on property rights issues, all the time, almost without exception, when I have somebody call me, there might be people in this room who have called me out of the blue. I know I get a lot of these calls, and they think they're the only person in the state of Washington that's ever had what's happening to them happen. And they feel very alone in that fight. They're usually stunned and amazed that somebody else cares, because they've gone to their Christmas parties at work, or they've gone to family gatherings, and nobody wants to hear from them anymore because they're just bragging about their problem that they have at the county, right, or the city. And they feel alone. And that's how the other side wins. The environmental movement, the government, the special interests that are pushing a lot of these agendas, they want each of us to feel alone when we're in these fights. And the only way to make people not feel alone is to share their story and to help other people connect with them and to affiliate with them and to understand and to think, if it happens to them, it can happen to me. And that's the thing we have to remind everybody, is that all of these abuses of our freedoms and our property rights, if it can happen to them, if it can happen to that person, it can happen to us. Nobody's safe. And you can't move away from this, by the way. The people who think you're going to escape this moving to Idaho or Texas, you're postponing the inevitable. It is already there, and it will hit you there just as fast and as hard. You have to win where you live. Win where you live. Fight where you live. If you can't win, make it so miserable for the other side that they really don't want to even go down that road again. You have to have some sort of objective. You can't be a bitter critter about it. You can't have an angry, people will get angry just listening to the stories. If you go to the CAPR website, you'll see the story that we did about the oyster farm. Oysterville Sea Farms out in Pacific County. That story helped the planning director quit, actually. When she realized I was going to do that video, she quit the job. I mean, she didn't, which is very funny. I mean, she actually quit. I did a story once up in Whatcom County, and the planner I mentioned there quit as well. I should just start doing stories. We'd be cleaning out our planning departments all over the place. But, you know, and also it resulted in a change. I think it had an impact on their election out in Pacific County. Just having the truth about how ridiculous some of this behavior is. But those stories make an impact. It makes an impact in that community. It makes an impact in places that are far removed from Pacific County, who couldn't find Pacific County, or maybe even Washington State on the map with their current education skills. But they see that story and they think, my God, I can't imagine that guy's being treated that way. And it changes how they view things. So the power of video, or writing an article in an engaging way, the power is that stays up there for years. And sometimes I've done videos, and I've had somebody call me 3-4 years down the road. I almost don't even remember what story they're calling me about, but for whatever reason, it was on YouTube, and they saw it, and it impacted them today, and they called me about something else, right? And that can only be done by telling stories that are interesting. Telling those stories that connect people emotionally. Nobody's going to actually watch a 2-hour-long video, right, about the different analysis of buffer changes in the course of the history of the Shoreline Management Act. And they actually will not watch that video. If you don't believe me, go ahead and put one up like that on YouTube and then see what your count is in a couple years, and it won't change that much. But if you can tell a story in 3 to 5 minutes, and I know shorter is better. Some of these stories are complex, it's hard to tighten them down, but somewhere in that ballpark, 3 to 5 minute emotional story, there's a victim, there's a villain, and there's a story arc in between. And there's a call to action if you really do a good job with it. Get those stories out there, they make a difference. It's unbelievable the difference they make, and there should be some variety, they shouldn't all be the same. Finding compelling people to tell a story is helpful. It's this little known secret, but nobody actually cares about the $2 million waterfront home that they have to pay a little bit more in property taxes. As tragic as that might be, that story won't be that compelling to many people. But the retired state worker, disabled state worker in a wheelchair, that story is going to impact people. The victim in these cases, the more regular, the more people can relate to them, the better off that story is going to be. And I think that we have to seek those out, and a lot of people don't want their stories told. They want to talk to you because they want to unburden, but they don't want the story. I don't understand the psychology always of this, but they're afraid, right? They think if they're just quiet and they don't tell their story, that maybe that they'll treat us better this time. Now, I don't know. It's just how many, we've all heard this. How many of you have heard somebody, right, telling you, oh, I just want to be quiet about, in case I don't want to speak up and tell them through this because, sure, yeah, hundreds of times. Has it ever worked? The answer is no, it never works. If you're silent, they completely abuse you all the way to the end, destroy you as much as they possibly can, and then they move on. You don't get any extra bonus points for being quiet. You do, however, in some cases, not every case, but the more public and exposure you can give to the abuse that's going on, the more likely it is that I think you can make that stuff go away. CAPR told a story, one of our first Tales of Tyranny videos last year that we did was about a guy up in Bellingham who got charged with the great crime of washing his van. And it was a great crime. It was the prosecutor in Bellingham came after him, and he was going to court. It was $thousands fine, right? It was a big deal for washing his car, or washing his van. It's illegal to wash your car outside, unless you go through an incredible series of hoops. And so he went public. We did that video. He went public with it. The prosecutor was incredibly angry. Called him up, threatened him, did all this other stuff. And then right before he was going to court, they dropped it. Literally 30 minutes before the hearing. Because that story went public and he knew it was going to that prosecutor knew it was going to be more public if he was stupid enough to actually go through and stick this guy with a terrible crime. That's assuming the judge was as bad as most of the judges in our state are. But you go public with these things and you're more likely, I think, to have injustice reversed, injustice exposed, and the bureaucracy back off. When they know things are going to be exposed, the sunlight is the death of the bureaucracy. Exposing the truth and the things that they do and the abuses that they have is the last thing they want to ever have. Why do you think they're so terrified of public records requests, right? Or even calling them up. call up the Department of Ecology and try to get the names of everybody and tell them you're going to write a story about it. And just watch how they react. It's worse than even a caricature of a Dracula with the cross or something. It's that they are terrified of publicity. Bureaucracy works in darkness. And the abusive bureaucracy needs it really dark in order to flourish. The last thing they want is to be exposed. And telling the stories will help expose them. And it exposes them in a way that the groups that we have will only grow when people realize you're willing to stand up to these problems, expose what's happening, have people's story told, and start to connect with people who otherwise didn't think there was anything within property rights to do with them. And I believe that, I know to some extent I'm preaching to the choir here. There's nobody here that would probably disagree with that. It's just a good reminder to all of us because many of us get engaged in these fights, and we dig down in the weeds, and we're in Olympia, and we're arguing about 200-page white papers, or whether that's whatever the issue is that we're fighting on. Sometimes it's good to step back. Let's find somebody that's been abused by this statute. It's not a theory. It's a human interest story, so that we can make a difference where we live. So with that, I'm going to close my portion of this, and thank you. And I guess I have time, Scott, unless you really are eager to get up here. I've got a few more minutes. If anybody has any questions, yes?
So if I have an awesome story in my town, but I don't run my video camera very well, can I call you, or do you know of somebody that can come and help out?
So the question is, you have an awesome, and that's in Skamania, right?
Well, I don't have the story yet, but if it comes my way,
okay.
What do I do?
Okay, so the question is, I have an awesome story where I live, and I don't have a video camera, what do I do? Do call us and talk about the story. And if there's a way for us to find a way to do it, we can. If I can put you in touch with somebody else to help me tell the story, we will. It isn't a super secret sauce. We aren't trying to, we have no monopoly on this. I don't have monopoly on this. CAPR doesn't have monopoly on this. My ideal world would we have 100 people like me out there telling stories everywhere. I want the most number of people possible doing it. I'd like to teach people how to do it. It's not as easy as it sounds, but I would like to help. So if you have a really good one, let me know. That'd be great. Yes?
Okay, so in my little world, before I became a representative, the scariest person in the whole world was they. That's T-H-E-Y, they. They kept our farm from doing a lot of good things.
Right.
And I'm really confused as what benefit do they get when they take down the average citizen?
Good question. So the question is, in my world, I have a farm, and the greatest fear is they. Who are they? The bureaucracy, the bureaucrats, whoever they are, and what they can prevent our farm from doing. And what do they get out of this? My experience with bureaucrats, many of you, I guess, you probably have the same experience, is that it tends to all be about power, money, and control. That's what it comes down to. Now, those are easy throwaway words. But what do they really mean for a bureaucrat? And somebody who works in one of these agencies. The individual motivations sometimes vary a little bit. They could be an ideologue, and it's just about growing their power base. But what I find most of the time is that they're motivated sometimes by ideology, but mostly bureaucrats are motivated by how do I move up my food chain where I work to make a little bit more money, to have a little bit more power. The best way to have more power in a bureaucracy is to have more of a reason to exist. The easiest way to exist, to justify your existence, is to grow the power of the bureaucracy, which means you either need to grow legislation and control or issues like that, or find some other way to expand the scope of a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy always exists to perpetuate itself. And it's like a virus or anything else that wants to grow. And so they have to find things to do. And the only way, especially if you're a highly motivated bureaucrat, which seems to be an oxymoron, but they actually do exist, they're the scariest ones of all. In order for them to get paid more, move up that food chain, they have to be able to show that I stepped into this position and there were only 3 people there and our budget was $10 million. And when I left, now there's 17 people and our budget's $100 million, so therefore you need to pay me twice as much and move me up to even a greater operation. And that tends to be, it could be nothing more than that. Very rarely do I think bureaucrats are motivated by some evil, nefarious, Soros-backed conspiracy. I don't think any of them would even think that way. Some will, but very, very few. Most of them really have just, it's about moving in a much smaller world than that. They just want to move up to that next space. My dad used to talk about hiring city managers. It's something that he hated to do in Newcastle. And in fact, Newcastle had no city managers for quite a long time. They didn't even have a bureaucracy for a while until he was overruled. And when they finally did bring in a city manager, Newcastle had the largest reserve fund in the state for a city that size. They also had the lowest tax rate of anybody around there. When they brought in a manager, that reserve fund was gone in less than 2 years, and they were in more debt than their neighbors, and they didn't have a hell of a lot more to show for it except for a bigger payroll. So it's the nature of bureaucracy, and it isn't to this overall evil conspiracy. It just has terrible results. So I tend to look at that starve the beast model of approaching government, and I think there's a lot of merit to it within certain areas of government. You just shrink their budget because there's no other way to get them under control. They'll never reform. They'll never want to change. The change is totally alien to their advancement in that world. There's no way you're going to get them to change. So sometimes you just have to downsize, those, or even move that agent, eliminate it, or totally change it. So. And then every now and then you run into the bureaucrat with an axe to grind, and that's a nightmare when you run into those guys. And I'm finding more and more of them that come out there, and they're the worst because they are the ideologues, and they don't care. They enjoy hurting people, and I don't know any other way to describe it. And those are the ones that are the scariest of all. Yes, sir. I think I'm almost on my last question. Yes.
Kind of a little thing yet about the bureaucracy and how they perpetuate. When I was in the legislature, the Puget Sound Cleanup Fund was a 2-year sunsetted program with 7 employees.
Right.
And so when the sunset came along, and it was the day certain comes along, state government ceased to exist and stopped because they were going to fire 7 employees.
Yeah.
And they created, nothing would happen. So finally they figured out how to save those 7 employees. But the entire government was shut down.
Right. And just for the purpose of the video, so it was an experience with a state agency that had a sunset clause, only 7 employees, and when that sunset clause came, it was going to be shut down, and the whole state government shuts down to find some way to keep those 7 employees on the payroll and expand the project that was otherwise going to go away. And that actually is the story of government. So with that, thank you so much.